The question is it possible to be good without God? Now, what's interesting about the question is, are you asking, hypothetically, philosophically, if God did not exist, would there be a conception of good which we could live out? Or are you saying that within Christian theism, given that a God exists, who is goodness himself, if a person is not properly directed towards him, who is without sanctifying grace, without the divine life in the soul, they're in a state of spiritual death, so to speak, can they perform an action that is good? Now, some people would propose the idea that that can't be the case, because even if you feed the poor, you could do it for selfish reasons. So is the act even good anymore because the motive behind it is not good? Even if the act is objectively a material good, right? Without belief in God, but both are good questions. Okay, so in Christian theology, God is goodness himself. He is subsistent being, right? Let me start with that. So God is subsistent being. He exists in and of himself. Within God, existence and essence is identical. All right? It is his very nature to exist. Okay? We, on the other hand, we participate in existence because we receive something outside of ourselves. Our essence is such that we don't necessarily exist. We're contingent. We may exist or we might not exist. So God is being itself. So if we come into being, we go from the potentiality of existing to actually existing. As we go from non-being to being, we participate in God, who is being itself. God is not just another being among beings. He is being itself, the ground of being, so to speak. We exist because God gives us existence. And inasmuch as we have existence, we participate in something that is his by nature, but is ours by grace. Okay? Likewise, God is goodness itself. God is beauty itself. God is truth itself. And when we see things that participate in truth, in beauty, in goodness, we are drawn to these things naturally, even if we may also have a propensity or a disposition against doing so. But that would be the whole nature of sin. Now, when a person, so I would say, just as we exist, we are participating in the existence of God, that we don't exist in such a way to be in a vacuum against goodness. Okay, there is a natural goodness about us. You know, so when a mother who has no belief in God looks upon the face of their child while they're nurturing them and feeding them, nursing them, are experiencing a genuine attraction and connection and goodness of the way in which nature's God has created nature and how we're participating in it. I would also propose that it is a mere intellectual construct to propose that anybody could be in a mere state of nature. All right? So I'm going to build, number one, I think there's goodness in nature. All right? Because nature's God is goodness itself. I will build upon that as grace builds upon nature. God, or no human being, is completely without grace. Even in the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, even those who are rejecting God's grace are given sufficient grace. They're given sufficient grace. It's a kind of common grace, right? So nobody is in a mere state of nature. All right? God's goodness extends beyond what we are by nature to gift us with more than what nature can give. The gift of sanctifying grace is the gift of His divine presence in the soul, which is above nature, right? But even those without sanctifying grace are still being wooed by prevenient grace, that grace that goes before, that grace that draws. Right? Nobody comes to the Son unless the Father draws him. Right? So I hope that kind of expands upon the conceptions of goodness, understanding our nature and understanding graced nature. There is no man who's totally void of the grace of God, so to speak. You might be able to have intellectual, mere constructs in the mind of such a thing, but in reality, I don't think anybody is in a mere state of nature with no grace, no wooing, no nothing. As such, even though nature is sufficient in of itself for a good act, grace builds upon nature, strengthens nature to do what nature does, and also to draw us beyond it, to be more than just ourselves, but to participate in divine life, to participate in the divine nature, to share in His holiness, something that goes above and beyond natural strivings. It's what the mystics refer to as union, what the Eastern Orthodox refer to as theosis and deification, to be completely distinguished from the topic of one simple voice and their pantheistic conception of the world. I think some people have kind of gotten into trouble theologically because of Luther's conception of the bondage of the will. He actually has a work entitled The Bondage of the Will, where he speaks of the will completely enslaved. The Catholic Church doesn't have this conception of the bondage of the will that Luther taught. The Catholic Church teaches that we have been deprived, that depravity is a result of deprivation of grace, and not having our will and our intellect properly directed. As such, it has weakened, but it has not destroyed our ability to will. But we are still a slave to sin when we sin. But God can deliver us from that as well. So the will isn't destined to always be directed away from Him, being directed towards the self or to a creature or anything within nature, instead of to nature's God. One way of looking at this is, we were talking about the powers of the soul earlier. We were talking about that we were created in the image and likeness of God, and one of the powers of the soul is the intellect. So I would argue that the intellect is proof that we have a natural desire for God. We have a natural desire for God because the intellect here and now enjoys thinking of God as the cause through studying that cause's effects. We can come to know God as the philosophers did. But that the intellect finds its rest in not only seeing the effects of the cause and coming to know the cause through the effects, but to know the cause as it is in and of itself. This is something that is natural to the nature of the intellect, to be drawn towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. The intellect has a natural longing, so to speak, or desire to achieve the end for which it was given. We were given an intellect to perceive goodness and truth and beauty. And since God is truth itself, beauty itself, and goodness itself, the intellect naturally goes that way. Like, for instance, to give a biblical allusion to this, is when Paul talks about how from what has been made from creation, the invisible qualities of God is made known to all. All right. That is, we can come to know by our mind, through philosophy, by means of reason alone, that God exists and what some of His qualities are. But then Paul goes on to say that even though even though these things are plain to them, they continue to direct their will towards the creature, towards created things, and towards themselves and their passions and their lusts. I think one of the great tragedies of humanity is for the intellect to be so darkened and the will so wounded, and the will so weakened that the best that they can perceive is such a dim, pale, incorrect conception of beauty and truth and goodness that it's just sad. There's that imagery that Christ gives when he's, I think it was Christ. It may have been James, I don't remember. But he refers to as a dog returning to its vomit, and a sow returning to dirty itself in the mud. I think at times we do, in fact, get glimpses of holiness, of goodness, some ray of light, some movement of grace. And it seems like a lot of people stifle it immediately. And then perhaps claiming altogether that they never had them at all, or forgetting about them, which can very easily be the case.